Welcome back, everyone, to another awesome chapter in our family communication semester. And so this is one of my absolute favorite chapters to talk about because I think not only is conflict an interesting topic to talk about, but I also think that this chapter is a great way to apply a lot of the theories and foundational ideas that we learned in our earlier chapters 1 through 5. And you can see them actually really pulled through in this chapter, right? Our discussion of roles, our discussion of culture, our discussion of communication principles all get pulled into this awesome chapter. I know this chapter can be a little overwhelming because it has a lot of key definitions in it, so I hope that in this lecture I'll be able to tease out some of those ideas for you so you can better understand them. So let's go ahead and dive in to our discussion. So one of the first things we have to recognize is that all conflict involves an understanding, I think, of power. And power is part of family systems. So even though it may not seem obvious to all of us, power is a big part of our systems. Power is always present in the room. It's just the extent to which it is shared with other people, right? And not all power issues result in conflict, but it is important to think about power as we are engaging in conflict because power has an immense effect on the way or the process of how we manage conflict. And that's very key, right? So if you think about a parent, right? A parent is someone who has power over their children. So if the parent and a child are in conflict with one another, really the person with power, in this example, the parent, they are the ones that get to control the flow of the conversation, the process of the conversation, and the way the conflict is managed. So for example, if the child wants to express his or her point of view, the parent has the power to shut down that conversation completely. So in this example, we can see that how families manage conflict is more important than just how much conflict that they have. And I have that here in this statement. You can see that I put it in bold, in blue, and red. The amount of conflict is less important than the way family members express and manage conflict. And that's important to recognize because conflict is inevitable. It is something that will occur in all of your deep relationships that you have with anyone, be they your child, your romantic partner, your family members, your parents, your aunts, your uncles, what have you. All of us have engaged in conflict, and that's really a natural part of human relationships and human existence, quite frankly. And so for us as communication scholars, it's really not about trying to stop conflict from happening. It's really about learning to manage conflict. And that is what this chapter is for. It's giving you the skills you need to manage and work through conflict with others in a productive way rather than a destructive way. And so to start off this conversation, I have a clip actually from one of my most favorite Simpsons episodes here. And so in this clip, the Simpsons have been having a lot of conflict lately. And so they go see Dr. Marvin Monroe, who is a therapist, and he gives them electroshock aversion therapy. And in this session, they actually literally get to push each other's buttons. So they actually get to shock one another and express their frustration for one another through shock therapy. Of course, this is an exaggeration. This is not real therapy, but I love this episode because I think it's a great metaphor for how people within families really crave and want a voice and want to be able to have power and want to be able to be part of decision making and get their feelings heard and get their concerns met. And so I think that this is a great metaphor for understanding that idea. And so moving on to understanding a little bit more definitions before we start applying. So we've talked about power, let's talk about culture. And culture plays a big role in the way that we approach the process of conflict. Again, I'm focusing on the way we manage the conflict right now, not just the end result. And so just as power will influence the way the conversation is directed, culture will also impact that as well. And the reason for that is because different cultures, because they value different things, approach that process with different goals. So your book provides you this example of collectivism and individualism. So in the United States, we are generally an individualist culture. What that means is that we prioritize the person before the group. And so the best example I have of that is, think of the American dream, right? So we have this idea of the American dream that if you try really hard and pull yourself up by the bootstraps, you can make it and do anything you want, right? And the American dream is about the individual, right? Realizing his or her dreams in the United States. And so, for example, it is not uncommon in an individualist society for children to leave the home. It's not uncommon for children when they go to college far away from their parents, right? If it's to accomplish their dreams, it is important for them to do so. On the other end of the spectrum, we have collectivist cultures, and collectivist cultures are the opposite of individualist cultures. They believe it is important that you should put the group before your own personal concerns. And so collectivist cultures have a high value priority on making sure that everybody's needs are met in a society, that group goals are always before individual goals. And so they end up with a strong sense of community and a desire to put group goals ahead of everybody else. Why is this important for us? This is important for us for two reasons. One, whether you're individualist or collectivist, that will impact the way you approach conflict. So for example, if you're from a collectivist culture, what that means is your priority when you are approaching conflict is to save face, meaning that you don't want to embarrass other people, right? It's about community. You don't want to out anyone, right? You don't want to pull receipts on people and shame them. And so you typically in that situation will sometimes relinquish or give up your own personal desires in order to service the needs of the group. On the opposite end of the spectrum, if you're an individualist culture, what that typically means is that you are more willing to verbally and directly assert what you want and your needs in order to get them met, and you put group goals kind of in the background, right? And so there's no right or wrong in this. Students tend to think that, there's a right and wrong way to do it. The reason we're covering individualism and collectivism is simply to get us more self-aware of our cultural perceptions, and so that when we are operating from one cultural standpoint or another, that we're able to understand other people's cultural standpoints and why they approach conflict the way they do. Because we're from an individualist culture, I thought it would be important to give you an example of a collectivist culture. And so right there, you can see that I've given you a video from one of my favorite movies, Mulan. And in this movie clip, you can see that Mulan goes to meet the matchmaker, and the matchmaker is supposed to set her up with her future husband, right? And so the matchmaker talks to Mulan, and I want you to pay attention to what she says. She tells Mulan, to impress your future in-laws, you have to demonstrate a sense of dignity and refinement, and you have to be silent, and you have to be all these other things, right? That's an example of a collectivist culture, because the matchmaker is telling her, hey, I don't care what you are and your personality and what you like to be like. If you want to have a husband and get along with your husband's family, you have to melt into what the group wants. Right? So I like that example a lot because I think it helps us as Americans coming from an individualist culture understand a little bit more about what it means to be collectivist. However, remember that in our previous chapters, we talked about systems, right? Mesosystems, exosystems, so on and so forth. And so none of us are really exclusively individualist, and none of us are really exclusively collectivist. It's important to remember that we're usually a blend of both. So for example, I grew up in the United States, so I do have individualist tendencies and perceptions. However, I also was born in Vietnam. I'm an immigrant, and I grew up in a household that was very collectivist, that was very much focused on helping the family and prioritizing the family above my own needs. So I'm a mixture of both, and I would guess that a majority of you are also some mixture of both as well, because you've all grown up and experienced different exosystems and mesosystems in your life. Now that we've talked about power and culture, let's define what conflict is. And one of the most important things I want to remind you of is that it is a process, right? That conflict isn't just a little blip in your relationships that occurs and then goes away. It develops over time, and it really helps manage and develop relationships as well. And what I mean by that is that because family members are interacting in conflict, that will impact how they interact with each other in the future and the types of conflict that they have. So therefore, for us, conflict is a process, right? How you fight with your mother, for example, influences how you fight with her in the future, right? Because every past interaction will influence what you come to expect and how you behave in future interactions. And the key thing here is that it's about family members perceiving a disagreement. And I want to flush out the word perception, as I do here in my second bullet point, because it's important to remember that whether or not the conflict is real or imagined, if both people perceive that they are in a conflict, the conflict is real. And the best example I can give you of this is that sometimes we might fight with people in our family or our romantic partners or our friends even over something that when we look back on it, we're like, why did I fight about that with that person, right? Like, why was that even a big deal, right? So in the moment, it seemed like a really big deal to you and you were both having at it and fighting. And afterwards, you're both like, why? Why did we fight about that? So even though sometimes there might actually not actually be a real problem or be a real issue, it doesn't matter, because if you both perceive that there's a conflict, the conflict is real, right? So I have a clip from Home Alone here where you can see that different family members in this scenario are perceiving different conflicting ideals and desires, and that leads to this conflict here. So let's talk about, now that we've talked about power, we've talked about culture, we've defined what conflict is, let's go ahead and jump in and apply what we've learned from those definitions into how to manage conflict and different theories about it. So one of the different things I want you to recognize first and foremost is that conflict can be productive or destructive, right? And conflict, I know it really has this bad connotation, like it sounds a little scary, but conflict can be a great thing. If anything, if you take a moment to self-reflect on a lot of the key relationships you have, sometimes a conflict with someone actually gets you closer and bonds you even more, right? And so conflict can be a very positive thing because it's about learning about other people's needs, about learning how to express your needs, and really showing that you care about the other person by working through that conflict with them. However, of course, as many of you probably have experienced, conflict can be destructive, right? It can go completely out of control, and it can result in us saying or doing things that we later regret or don't mean. And so what we want to start by start in this conversation on figuring out how to make conflict productive rather than destructive is recognizing that there are two types of conflict that you want to focus on: solvable and perpetual. And these are actually from Gottman. He is a researcher who focuses a lot on interpersonal relationships and conflict. We'll talk about him a little bit later in this lecture when we talk about the 4 Horsemen of the Apocalypse. But really, when it comes to these two types of conflicts, it's important to recognize why they are important. So the first one is solvable conflicts. And these are conflicts that are resolved through productive communication tactics and responses. And what that means is that usually these are very short-term conflicts that can be resolved by explaining things more to someone, clarifying something for someone, responding to someone, asking them how they feel, right? So these communication behaviors help solve those conflicts. Perpetual conflicts are rooted in different values, different personality issues, and they are recurring. So usually solvable conflicts are kind of a one and done, right? They don't really establish a pattern, and they are very easily fixed with just some sort of clarifying communication behavior, whereas perpetual conflicts are much more deep-rooted in various conflicting personality or cultural issues. So the example I have here, I use The Simpsons again, and I try to find 2 parallel examples so that you could understand the difference. So here, Marge and Lisa are in a family conflict because Lisa is not doing so well at school. She's feeling sad. And so Marge uses a communication response to tell her, well, Lisa, you should smile and this is how you should appear happy. And then afterwards, when Marge feels that that doesn't actually fix Lisa's problem, she changes her mind and gives Lisa different advice. And she's like, you know what, Lisa, I'm so sorry. I apologize. I was wrong. I gave you the wrong advice. I think it's important that you share with me why you're sad so I can support you and help you as your mother. And so you can note here that Marge's communication, right? Her clarification of her advice, her apology to her daughter, all of those things help her daughter work through the problem that she's having. And actually at the end, you can see Lisa smile and Marge tells her, you don't have to smile anymore. Like, if you want to be sad, and I'll be here for you. And Lisa says, no, Mom, like, I feel like smiling now. And you can see that Marge's clarifying communication where she's strategically picking out things that she feels she did wrong, that she could do better, and trying to resolve the conflict in her communication fixes the issue. And you can see from the point of an audience member that this will not be an issue for Lisa and Marge, down the line. A perpetual conflict example I have for you here, you can see that it's between Homer and Bart, and it's a conflict resulting in Homer forgetting to pick up Bart from soccer practice. And why this is a great example of perpetual conflict is because Homer, because of his personality, he's a forgetful father. He's not very responsible. He's not super involved and engaged in his children's life. And so therefore, Bart is upset that Homer forgot about him. And it's not a one and done thing. It's because Homer's continually forgetting to support him, forgetting about Bart, that creates this long-term problem. So you can kind of see as you watch these two clips, these are two very different conflicts, right? Homer even tries to make Bart feel better by picking him up and giving him a sundae, right? And it doesn't really help Bart feel better at all because Bart is like, he always does this, right? This is just who my dad is. So that is a good example of a perpetual conflict where two people are constantly fighting because of their personality differences, value differences, role differences. Sound good? All right. So now that we have these kind of definitions underneath our belt, let's talk a little bit more about what I said earlier about our Gottman, our favorite researcher. And he came up with this 4 Horsemen of the Apocalypse model. And this name always kind of just, whoa, right? It's a very dramatic name. But it talks a lot about these 4 behaviors. So the behaviors of the 4 horsemen. And Gottman says that if these 4 behaviors are present in any given relationship, he can easily predict the end of the relationship. So the apocalypse, right? And so the 4 are criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling. And I have a little cartoon video here that actually is created by the Gottman Institute to help explain some of these. So if you want to watch that, I think it's a great example to kind of get you thinking about how you have experienced these behaviors or maybe engaged in these behaviors in your life. And so the first one here is criticism. This is when you are attacking a spouse's personality or character. Usually this involves a lot of blame. And I want to say that this is different from constructive criticism, right? So partners can give each other constructive criticism where they say, hey, I wish you could have done this better by doing A, B, and C. This is not that type of criticism. When Gottman says criticism, he's talking about criticism aimed at the person's sense of self and their personality and their self-worth, right? Contempt is the next one. This is when you have a lot of insult, a lot of psychological abuse. This is usually when you treat someone almost as less than. You don't see them as a valuable human being. And the next one on that one is defensiveness. So this is when you do not want to take responsibility for your behavior and you very much put up a wall, right? And you really don't want to admit to or talk about your own faults or your own contributions to the conflict. Stonewalling is the last one, which is when you restrict communication. You kind of literally put up a wall, if that makes sense, right? Where you talk very little, if not at all. You give the other person the silent treatment. Any type of nonverbal expression usually is very contemptuous, full of spite, right? and you kind of give off this air of, I just don't want to talk to you, and I don't care about you, and I don't want to talk about this conflict anymore. And so Gottman says that if all four of these pieces are present, it is incredibly highly likely that the relationship will end. And so I'm sure that many of you have experienced one, if not all, of these behaviors in your various relationships. So it's a great source to understand how this model can help us see how these behaviors impact our relationships and how we feel about the other person and how we feel about ourselves. Moving on, this is another model that can help us. This is called the explanatory model of interpersonal conflict. And literally, if you're having a hard time understanding this model, I know that it really comes off quite aggressively, like there's a lot of pieces to it, right? Gottman's model was very easy with these 4 horsemen, and then you go to this model and you're like, oh my gosh, there's just so much more. I want you to, when you're looking at this model, try to understand them in context, right? Try to understand them together rather than separately, because all of these pieces of the model that I have in color here are explanatory. So if you're having a hard time studying, just remember that the explanatory model tries to explain the context of the conflict. And so the model, what it does is it asks you, the family scholar, to look at these 5 pieces that I have here on my mouse, 5 pieces of the conflict. And if you look at these 5 pieces, you are more able to understand the conflict and how to resolve it, and the different values at play. I love this model because at times when we're kind of caught up in conflict, even if it's not our own conflict, right? We're hearing conflict from other people. It's usually very emotionally charged, and it's hard to think rationally about the conflict. So I love this model because it is the best way to step back and think rationally about it by looking at all these different pieces. So let's look through them from top to bottom. So I'm going to look at distal context first. And so distal context is everything that happened before the conflict. So your personalities, your past experiences with the other person, the environment, right? If it's an open environment with a lot of shared power, if it's a closed off environment where power is not shared at all, because we have to look at what happened before the conflict, what the relationship was like before the conflict, because it helps us understand how the conflict occurred and how it escalated, right? So for example, if you have a history of having a lot of toxic conflict with someone else, and I look at your distal context, that will help me as a scholar and as a family communication researcher understand more of how you got to this current conflict that you're in, right? Even on a interpersonal level, if you take a moment and self-reflect, as I said before, conflict is a process. So every single time you have a conflict with someone, how that conflict plays out and the results of it will always impact future conflicts. Right? So if you're interacting with someone that you know is really sensitive and blows up at you a lot and is very defensive, you might change the way you manage conflict with them, right? And so that's a distal context, right? It's all the background, all the stuff that happened before the conflict itself, including past conflicts. Then we have proximal context, which is a little bit more present. So this includes your goals, rules, emotions of the person, right? And that can change, of course, with time because all people change, right? So your goal right now might be to complete school. And so you might have conflict with your family members because of that goal. And later on, when you're done with school and it's not a goal of yours anymore, that might no longer be part of your proximal context, right? And so therefore you may or may not have conflict regarding going to school because obviously you would have finished. And so proximal context is important because it involves the individuals, right? It's analyzing where is each individual at in the conflict, right? Where have they been? What are their goals? What are their feelings? What are their attributes? All of that. Then we get to conflict interaction, and this is a piece that helps us understand the different strategies that each person is using in the conflict, right? And those strategies, like I said earlier, are informed by or depend upon the distal and proximal context, right? So how the background personalities of each person and the current goals, rules, emotions of each person influence how they interact. Okay, so we're kind of seeing how all these pieces build together. And so that kind of helps us understand the different patterns that occur within a conflict, and the different tactics, right? So I have an example here from the show Louie. And in this clip, his daughter wants an ice cream, and he says, well, your sister ate the last one. And she says, well, that's not fair. And he's like, well, doesn't matter whether or not it's fair to you or not. That's kind of the reality. And he tries to teach her that sometimes things aren't fair. And she keeps repeating to him, but that's not fair, but that's not fair, right? So if we look at the proximal context, we can understand that her goal is for things to be fair, right? Whatever my sister has, I want to also have. And his goal as a parent is to try to use this as a life lesson, right? And teach her that sometimes things won't always be fair. You won't always get what you want all the time, right? And he tries to move her towards things being equal rather than being fair. And so you can see that the strategies he uses in order to get to that goal, his proximal goal of trying to make it a life lesson, are slowly explaining to her, okay, this is what fairness means. This is why fairness isn't always possible. This is why equality is better to strive for, blah, 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 right? And I love this clip because I think it's a great example of how each person's goals in the interaction fuels their strategies, because her goal, like I said, is just to get things to be fair in her view of whatever fair is. So her message and her communication pattern is just repeating, but it's not fair, but it's not fair, but it's not fair, right? And I think it's a great way to understand parenting as well, because oftentimes conflicts between parents and their children usually result in children wanting one thing and parents wanting a different thing for them, right? And it's up to the parents to try to explain to the child that, yes, what you want right now, though, doesn't quite make sense or isn't quite appropriate for the situation. And the child having to try to learn that and understand that and set aside their own goals and understand what their parent is trying to teach them. So then we have proximal outcomes. So these are the after effects immediately of the conflict. So for a lot of us, after we have a conflict, it's not just, even once the conflict is resolved, you still feel a little weird, right? It's not like, okay, we resolved our conflict, let's go to Chuck E. Cheese, right? It's not so easy to kind of get over the conflict. It does take some time. And usually the immediate consequences are feeling kind of weird, feeling exhausted, feeling tired, feeling like you need space from the other person. But ideally then, if we want productive conflict, we get distal outcomes, meaning very far along, the path, that we look back on it and we're like, yeah, I'm glad we had that fight. Or we look back on it and I'm like, yeah, I learned a lot from that fight. I learned a lot from that conflict, right? Distal outcomes can also be negative, where we look back and we're like, wow, yeah, that was the fight that caused us to break up, or yeah, that was the fight that caused this to happen, right? So they can be positive or negative, but these are usually outcomes that occur far down the line after the conflict is over, and oftentimes you can't really see them in that moment, right? You only see them after the fact. So now that we've looked at that model, let's look a little bit at how we respond to family conflict, specifically our conflict styles. And I touched on conflict styles a little bit earlier when I talked about individualism and collectivism. And so this will kind of be our teasing out of these ideas, and I'll refer back to individualism and collectivism throughout this discussion as well. So, conflict tactics are the smaller individual moves that people enact to carry out their style. And so as you're looking through this section of our lecture, I think it's important that you self-reflect and think, what do I tend to do in most of these situations that I involve in conflict? And so the first one is non-confrontation, which is when you decide to just not deal with it, right? You kind of withdraw, you indirectly, passively deal with the conflict. You avoid the conflict altogether. If you're someone that just doesn't like confrontation, this is typically the style that you engage in. Solution orientation is when you are trying to focus on the solution, right? So instead of arguing about the problem with the other person, you focus on brainstorming different solutions that will make both of you happy. Usually this involves reasoning with the other person, having a lot of discussion and talks with them, compromising with them. And of course, this is typically something that doesn't happen overnight. This usually probably involves multiple conversations with the other person in order to come up with a solution that works, okay? Then there's control, which is when you are someone that takes up the mantle of more power. You engage in a lot of hostility, a lot of confrontation, criticism, blaming of the other person in a negative way. So this is when you're trying to control the other person rather than involve them in solving the problem. So very different from solution orientation. So we talked about power, and let's talk a little bit more about how it helps us understand the different styles that we engage in. So as I said earlier, power is your ability to direct conversation. It involves your ability to make decisions for other people. It is really the capacity to influence others' goals, rules, roles, and patterns of communication. So with my example that I had earlier, if you're a parent, you have power over your child. So therefore, you have power over what kinds of conversations they can bring up or not bring up, where the conversation goes, how the conversation ends, right? You have that power. And power, like I said, is always there. It's the extent to which it is shared. So that's really what power as capacity means. It's, you can have power, but that doesn't mean you exercise it, right? You could share it with other people. Power is perceptual too. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you go to Target and buy one box of power. It's really about how other people perceive the power that you have. So for example, you might be someone who is in a position of power. You're a grandparent, you're a parent, you're someone of high status in the family. But if other people do not perceive you as having power, then that influences whether or not you truly do, right? Likewise, you might be someone that doesn't really have a lot of official power, but if people perceive you as being a powerful person, you do have power. And so perception, just like with conflict, is important in power as well. And so you can see here that I have a clip from Modern Family on a power play. And so Cam and his partner are here talking about their different trophies. And so one puts his trophy above his partner's trophy, and his partner sees that as him trying to gain more power and prestige. And that is an example of relational power, where family members try to impact and influence one another. And really it depends on, because it's relational, right? It's about the relationship you have with other people. You end up being constrained by the other person's response, right? That's different from dependence power, where one person is more willing to end a relationship than the other person. This we typically see in cases of abuse, both psychological and physical, where the one person, right, holds the majority of the power, and they usually threaten the other person, hey, I'm going to leave you, or hey, I'm happy to be without you. And so by saying that, they have all the power, and the other person who doesn't want the relationship to end relinquishes a lot of power to them, right? And so the other person becomes dependent on them because of that. So power is important because it helps us understand the dependence and all the other issues that occur within relationships. But most importantly, power is involved in decision making, right? And families, like we said before, are systems. And so decisions always have to be made, and things always have to change in order for families to thrive and grow and continue to survive throughout the years. And so decision making is important because it's really about, how do we get things done? When can we get them done? Who is this going to affect, and why? And who really gets to make those decisions, right? So there's a couple ways that family members make decisions. The first is appeals to authority, right? So this is when you go to the highest status person in society, right? So siblings, for example, might go to their parents and complain about their other siblings, right? So they might use their parents as an authority figure to punish their other siblings. Another example might be rules, right? Rules are established and shared by everyone in the family. We talked about this with rules and roles in the past, right? So it's important to revisit that if you don't remember. But rules are there to help families function, right? So sometimes when someone breaks a rule, usually the rule becomes the source of how we make this decision, right? So if someone breaks the rule, our decision to punish them is based off the rule itself. How we make decisions might be based off rules that we already have, right? So it is important to do that. So I know a family, for example, that they prioritize education over everything else. So the rule they have with their children is you can play sports, you can do all the extracurriculars that you want. However, you have to finish your homework and you have to do well in school. And the moment you're not doing well in school, you can't play football, you can't do all those extracurriculars that you want. So the kids had to agree to that rule. And so one of the children actually ended up not doing too well in one of his math classes. So his parents decided that, okay, well, you broke the rule, so now we have to take away football. So that's a situation where the parent isn't just stepping in as the authority figure, right, to do it. It's the parent is leaning on the rule that was already agreed upon by the child and the parent before the incident happened. Okay. And then decisions are also based on values, right? So families sometimes have decision-making purposes based off different principles. Depending on the culture that you grow up in and the way your family is set up, as we've talked about in the past, every family shares values, right? And they can be different. And so when you base a decision off your values, it's really based off what your family thinks is most important or right or wrong. This is really where individualism, collectivism come in together, right? So if you come from a collectivist family, it is very unlikely that you will want to kind of break away and go transfer to a 4-year university that's very far away, right? Because the values of your family is that you stay close together, right? That you support one another. How can you do that if you're moving far away? That's one example, right? And so your decision to stay at home will be heavily influenced by your collectivist value set, if that makes sense. And if you need more examples, please let me know. I know this third one can be a little tricky because values are a lot harder to understand than rules, because rules are much more explicitly stated most of the time, whereas values are shared and not explicitly shared out. De facto decisions are when a family doesn't really sit and talk about the decision. They don't engage in decision making, so therefore the decision is just made by default by either the event passing and occurring or someone just standing up and making the decision, everybody going with it. One of the things I want to call your attention to is this video. This, I think, is one of my favorite examples of decision making in families because this is a clip from the movie Louie, and in this clip he talks about the two are divorced, so they're separated, but they have children together. So they're talking about where to send their kids. So she wants to send them to private school. He wants to keep them in public school. And I really encourage you to watch this video because I think it is such a real world, even though it's a TV show, I think it's such a real world example of how these conversations play out. And I think his character does a great job of trying to pull the conversation back from being too destructive. And so what you can see here is that in this clip, because these two are, basically jockeying for power, right? They're fighting over who has more power over their children's lives. And so one comment that she makes is that she basically makes more money. So she can afford to send her kids to private school, and he cannot. She is exercising what we call manifest power by doing that. She's imposing her will. She's saying, well, because I make more money, I have more power, so you're going to do what I want, and I want to send the kids to private school, right? He doesn't want to give that up, and so he's not trying to engage in any latent power, which is the wishes of someone who is where someone is more powerful or met. Even though he recognizes that she makes more, he's saying, hey, I don't care that you make more and that you have that financial power. I am not going to engage in this. So he tries to reject that latent power from her. Again, I love this clip. I think it's so good for helping us understand power. And I think latent power actually is the most elusive type of power because it's power where you don't assert yourself, but people listen to you. So therefore you have power by the sheer virtue of people listening to you and making the decisions that you want made, right? So anytime one person's decisions are made, you usually can identify that person as having the most power. So let's talk about decision making and power a little bit more. So your book has a great discussion of family types and how that impacts decision making and power. Like I said earlier, this is directly from our chapter 1 discussion of family configurations. And family configurations are important because a family's configuration does definitely factor into how, how the communication about the conflict proceeds, right? So for us, like I said, it's not just the conflict that's important, it's how the conflict is handled. And so gay and lesbian families, for example, tend to have more equality based communication in their relationship. Like that becomes a big goal for them. And so you can see that play out in the way that they handle conflict in their family. Step families tend to assert power over one another, especially in the initial stages of the relationship. This is typically because step families don't have like that shared common history just yet at the beginning of their relationships, right? Like you just meet your stepmother or stepfather or whatever, and you don't really have a relationship with them yet. And so therefore, we tend to see in those family configurations more power being asserted really aggressively and assertively from the get-go. That might change over time, as we talked about, because conflict is a process. And because over time you might develop a relationship with your stepfather or stepmother, right? So you might not have those power plays happening as much anymore, but you definitely see them in step families at the very beginning of the relationships. Culture, like we said before, impacts it. Cultural values impact how a family makes decisions because how power is distributed in different cultures matters. And so the example I have for you here is child marriage in Bangladesh. I really encourage you to watch this. It's a very short mini documentary. It follows the story of young girls who get married off at 13, 15 years old to older men because women in this society have very little power. And so because they have very little power, the only value that they have socially is in how they get to be married. And so, the girl here you see crying, she wanted to continue studying and going to school to become a doctor. But her family married her off. And when the reporter asked her mother, like, why did you marry your daughter off? Like, she clearly has, a lot of these dreams and goals to be a doctor, and she definitely has the will and the intelligence to do it. And her mother responds, I don't have the money and the ability to raise her to become a doctor and go to school. And even then, because there's so few female doctors in our society, the likelihood of her being able to achieve those educational goals is so small. So therefore, it makes more financial sense for me to just marry her off because I can't afford to send her to school and I can't afford to support her through that. So it's really interesting. I really recommend that you see this. This is, of course, one snapshot of a multitude of different cultures. But like I said, who has power in a society is definitely related to the decisions that are being made. So here, this girl can't make the decision for herself. She clearly states that she does not want to be married and that she wants to go to school. But that decision, she doesn't have that decision-making power. She has no power. And her mother has some power, but even then, the decision that her mother makes to marry her off is still based on the fact that she knows that her daughter, just like her, has to be married off in order to be able to financially survive. So it's quite an interesting documentary. I really recommend you look at it to kind of understand the nuances, because I know that in our book, it a lot of technical words, a lot of vocab, a lot of just context and density. I really want you to see how this plays out, in our real world, and how important it is for us to study what we're studying so that we can understand these issues and act on them if necessary. So moving on, let's talk a little bit more about relationships and power. And I want to talk most importantly about how we use power to control one another in relationships. So here on this slide, I'm talking about different responses that we have to each other. And when I say each other, to people in deep relationships. Excuse me. So we have people that are either equal, subordinate, or superior. Okay. So if we perceive someone to be equal to us, we will engage in what we call a one-across response, where we probably show them a lot of respect in our communication. We invite them in on the conversation, and we try to evenly distribute our power, share our power with them. If we see them as a subordinate, so for example, we are a parent, they are a child, right? We will assert ourselves with a one-up response where we try to gain power over the other person. This also occurs in romantic relationships where one person sees the other person as less than, like subordinate to them, so they try to control that other person using a one-up response. A one-down response is when we see the other person as superior to us, so we relinquish, we give them power, right? You usually see the subordinate and superior responses tied together. So the subordinate, the person with power will use a one-up response because they want to hold on to their power. The person without power will use a one-down response because they're being, oppressed and asserted upon, and they will relinquish power to the other person. How does this play out in relationships? You can have two types. There are complementary and symmetrical. And I will say now that this sometimes takes a little bit of time to understand because the terms I think are very similar, complementary and symmetrical. And so I put two examples here to kind of try to clarify for you. So symmetrical is when people try to mirror each other. They have the exact same conflict management style and they do the same thing. So if you are someone that really likes to be non-confrontational and your partner also doesn't like confrontation and you both just don't confront one another, that's symmetrical. You can also be someone who's very competitive in your conflict, and then your partner is also competitive. So because you're the same thing, you're symmetrical, okay? If you're complementary, that means that you're opposite from one another, but you complement or it works with one another, right? So someone who's assertive usually complements someone who is passive, right? So one of my close friends, she tends to be a little bit more passive. She doesn't really feel comfortable with making decisions, so she passes that off to her partner who is naturally more assertive, and so they match quite well. Oh, my dog just came in, sorry. Hi, Bubs. I'm lecturing. All right. Sorry about that. So you can see there that I have two examples here where both people compete in this example. So they are symmetrical. Here, each individual takes different approaches. So this is actually from the movie The Breakup, and this is from Modern Family. And this scene from Modern Family is when Gloria, she takes a very long time to get ready for things, and her husband is trying really hard to not be overly bearing when he's trying to get her to speed things up, right? So when she's being like, yes, I can't wait to get ready and be on time and go to this dinner, he's trying to kindly and gently, push her in a different direction. And you can see that she responds much more assertively by telling him to hey, calm down, don't rush me. And he's like, oh, I'm not trying to rush you, I'm just, don't worry about it, and he approaches it in a less assertive way because he believes that that's the best thing for the situation. And I love this video because it's a great example of how conflict is a process, because you can see that throughout the video, he starts changing his mind and realizing, okay, maybe the way I'm approaching this conflict is not giving me the results I want, right? So I recommend that you watch this to kind of see these two examples play out. So violence in the family. This is family violence is always something that interests me because when we're looking at the macro systems that we've studied before, it's important to recognize how those systems also influence violence in the family. And I also would like to say that I think that when we're looking at these different theories on violence, self-reflect on whether or not you think these theories work for you, because violence is such a complex issue that involves power, it involves value, it involves societal issues. It's important to see kind of which ones work for your experience and that you can apply to your own family setting. So the frustration aggression hypothesis is a hypothesis that helps us understand that violence comes from blocking each other's personal goals, right? So think of it as I get frustrated, at my partner or at whoever that I perceive as a block, right? An obstacle to my goals. And so therefore I become aggressive. That's basically what this hypothesis says. The catalyst hypothesis says that violence occurs because of certain conditions, right? So the catalyst hypothesis would say that the seeds for violence are kind of always there in your relationship, and one thing sparks it, triggers it, and then the violence occurs. Skills deficiency refers to the fact that some people may not have the communication skills necessary in order to work through their conflict, so therefore they result to violence, because that's a more natural way of dealing with conflict, right? So you think about it at a core level, as children, we learn to use our words, because one of the natural ways that we approach conflict is by physically fighting or hurting other people to express how angry or frustrated we are. And we learn to use our words. The skills deficiency explanation says that some people don't really learn how to use their words. Some people really don't learn the communication skills necessary in order to engage in conflict productively. So therefore they default to the physical, right? The violence. We actually see this quite a lot verified in different domestic violence research, where because men generally in society are socialized to not be emotionally expressive. So for example, it's okay for a little girl to cry, but if a little boy cries, he's told to stop crying because that's girly, it's not manly, right? So boys in different cultural contexts are taught to really suppress, right? And not deal with their emotions, not let them show. Studies have found that when that happens, those boys grow up into men that have never learned how to express their emotions, manage them, or deal with their emotions. So therefore, those men are much more likely to result in violence in their romantic relationships as a result. So the skills deficiency explanation really helps us understand that. Relational control theory states that violence results from dynamics between symmetrical and complementary relationships, right? So for example, those who receive violent treatment in turn treat other people violently, right? And so relational control theory states that the violence comes from the interaction between those symmetrical and complementary relationships. So my last few slides, sorry, my voice is kind of cutting out already. I know I put a lot here, but I felt that it was important that this was all on one slide, just so that it was easy for you to find and analyze, right? I felt that if I put it on different slides, students would not be able to understand that they're all related ideas. And I didn't want you to have to study them separately and think that they're different ideas when they're the same. So these are different assumptions behind family violence, so things we know about family violence. And I put them in bold. Okay. Those are the 4 assumptions. And then underneath each bold one, I put bullet points to help explain what that means. Okay. So the first one that we know is that we live in a violent society. The media reports stories and images of violence in the United States. Unfortunately, it's not uncommon for us to hear about mass shootings, for us to hear about other violent things happening on a day-to-day basis, right? And so because of that, this violence, this presence of violence in our society sometimes normalizes violence. Violence can also be gendered, right? Females tend to be the primary targets of violence because they typically are not only physically smaller in size, but also socialized to be submissive in their relationships. Again, I'm speaking very generally. And that is because that results in power discrepancies, and women then self-blame for violence acts that they are the victim of. And we see that so much in domestic violence, right? Where the woman is the victim of physical abuse or verbal abuse, and she blames herself for not being enough, right? Violent episodes are also perceived differently, right? So how violence is perceived in different family members differs, right? So one person might think that spanking a child is too much. Some persons might think spanking is just enough, like that's what they need, right? Some people think spanking doesn't go far enough, right? So how we perceive violence varies from person to person, context to context, right? Household to household. That also is influenced by society, right? So before, it may have been quite common for families to spank, and I think now where we are currently in our current history, it's not as acceptable as socially as it was before. So you can also see that systemically it changes in our society, and that influences how families perceive it as well. family violence is not isolated, right? So it is usually something that is part of the process of interpersonal communication. Violence doesn't come out of nowhere. It comes out of repeated interactions and communication patterns that occur between individuals. And this really helps us understand, what helps us understand this is systems, right? Our systems theory from our earlier chapter. Again, I'm pulling from those old chapters where we really understood how violence affects every piece of our system, and that it continues different communication patterns that continue and perpetuate violence as it goes on. And so I put here, like, remember your social exchange theory. I had you write about it in your family story projects because it's so important as a theory for helping us understand rewards and costs, comparison levels, and why people choose to stay in violent situations or not. So I have an example actually from Russia here, where in Russia a lot of women are experiencing domestic violence. There's a horrible story in here about a woman who was attacked by her husband with an axe, and even when she reported it to the government, they did not do anything. And I love this example because it really helps us understand how society and the government, so external factors of the family, influence the family. Because there are no definitive laws on domestic violence in Russia, this is why this continues to happen, and that these women do not have the protection of their government, right, and support of their government until it's too late sometimes. So I recommend you watch that as an example to understand these assumptions. I also have an example here from the movie Precious on how it's cyclical, right? As I said here, family violence is not an isolated event. It doesn't occur overnight. It's not something that just pops up out of nowhere and then never happens again. It's something that happens repeatedly, and it's shared between members. Sometimes I often think of it as a virus, right? And it affects people in different ways. Sometimes people who were victims of violence become abusers themselves. Sometimes people who are victims of violence stay victims of violence. Even once they leave that environment, they move on to another one. They become victims in that one as well, because they seek out the same type of personality of abuser, because that's what they're used to, you know, and that's it's tough to break this cycle, right? And so I have this clip from Precious because here, for those of you who've not seen the movie, there's this woman that you see in the screenshot right there. She had a daughter, and her daughter was raped by her boyfriend, the woman's boyfriend, and she blamed her daughter for her boyfriend leaving. So I wanted to show you this clip because I think it's a great example, even though it's, you know, it's a movie, it's a great example of real world systemic impacts of violence, right? So how this one act of violence against her daughter then resulted in her becoming violent towards her daughter as well. And it's important to understand then how families are systems, and how anytime one thing happens to one family member, it can happen to the other. And the last thing I want to talk about today is verbal aggression. And so people tend to think of violence as just the physical, right, hitting, but it also involves hurting other people with our words. And if there's anything we've learned in this semester so far, I do hope that you have learned that words matter, and how we say things matter, and what we say to other people matter. And so when we send messages that are meant to hurt other people, it's not just the words that are hurting, it's our intent behind it. Because when someone's trying to hurt you, you know, right? You know that someone's trying to harm you with what they're saying. And so therefore, it's that desire, knowing that, oh, this person wants to hurt me, that what hurts, right? Not just the words themselves. And so it's important, though, to look at aggression in the context in which it is found, right? Family members may not respond to one another in a way that is meant to elicit favorable impressions, right? People sometimes might engage in those four horsemen and might say something verbally contemptuous just because they want to, because they can, because of the emotions that are there and pent up. And so sometimes family members also don't care about the social desirability. They don't care about belonging. They don't care about the relationship at stake. And that, again, reiterates my point that conflict isn't something that pops up overnight, right? Where did this lack of care come from? Where did this attitude of, I don't care that I'm part of this family, or I don't care that I'm part of this society or this group, where did that come from, right? It must have come from somewhere. And so it's important to understand those proximal and those distal outcomes that we talked about before in our explanatory model. And that's a wrap. So I know that this has been a very long, chunky lecture and chunkier chapter to read, but I really do hope that this has been helpful for you in a lot of ways. And I also do hope that the videos that I've put here have been helpful for helping you understand the different theories that we've laid out. Again, everybody learns differently, and so if the examples here have not been helpful to you or that you want more examples, I'm always around and here to help you. So I'm a message away, right? Hop, skip away. So I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and I will see you all later. Bye.